Well, I think from the very beginning, at a time when a lot of the American automobile industry was still being run by inspired tinkerers, Walter B. Chrysler, who had a real respect for engineering, embraced university-trained engineers. And this was a company that was very proud of the fact and emphasized that they were an engineering-driven company. Well, he was a practical mechanic who had the opportunity from his upwardly mobile family to go to university and turned it down. Over his family's objections, he took a job with the railroad because he was fascinated with machinery. Intensely curious, he embarked on an apprenticeship as a machinist, took correspondence courses in engineering, peppered the editors of the magazine Scientific American with queries, and all of his life was intensely proud of the fact that he had worked with his hands, always referred to himself as a workman. These are the tools, some of which he made as part of his apprenticeship, and to the end of his life, they were displayed on the observation deck of the Chrysler building in New York in a glass case, because Chrysler always wanted to emphasize that he was an American workman. Henry Ford really was someone who became a popular ideologue based on the fact that he was trying to produce a car that was suitable for the masses. And he did it at a time when the notion of his backers was originally that cars were something that should be sold to the upper class. That was a different approach than Chrysler took, because Chrysler's intent was to build a company to rival General Motors. And he was never interested particularly in producing a car for the masses. And this was a car which in 1924 featured a high compression engine that was revolutionary for the time and a high-speed engine. This car would do an honest 70 miles an hour right off the showroom floor. And as a result, it became a very popular car entered in European road races. These cars did very well at Le Mans, Spa, a number of places, and they were competing with Bentleys and Alphas, Stutzes, much more expensive cars. Dodge had been involved in World War I, supplying what were really just touring cars to the U.S. Army. And in fact, what is supposedly the first mechanized cavalry charge was conducted in Dodge sedans. Willis Overland won the contract in 1940 from the U.S. Army to produce what was supposed to be a scout vehicle or reconnaissance vehicle that became known as the Jeep. Chrysler didn't actually take control of what became Jeep until 1987.
Oh, right.
What Chrysler did during the war mainly was produce tanks. And in fact, the tanks that, the Sherman tanks that Montgomery used against Rommel in North Africa were built by Chrysler and used a special Chrysler engine that they had tooled up because there was a scarcity of engines. And what they did was they bundled 5 automobile engines together to create a 450 horsepower tank engine.
5 together.
It was a real masterpiece of improvisation. And that's, you can see that's the engine behind us.
Oh, that's it.
And it's
fantastic.
It was referred to as it was referred to by the soldiers as the Dion Quince, after the quintuplets born in Canada, or the egg beater. But as you can see, these
3,
are
4, 5. There
right.
you are. Huh. That's
And it was
extraordinary.
because it was tried and true technology, of course.
Yeah.
It was complicated, but it was marvelously durable.
That's amazing. What sort of spin-offs were there from this war period that then carried on through to production models?
Well, for Chrysler, there were a couple of notable spin-offs. One was that Chrysler had kept up with the combustion research that had produced the first Chrysler, and they became interested in hemispherical combustion chambers. And Chrysler was convinced that they could produce a piston engine on their own that would be superior to the Rolls-Royce Merlin, which was the main liquid-cooled fighter engine during the war. And what they did was they produced a hemispheric combustion chamber 16-cylinder engine. And that's the engine that we see over and back of the tank engine.
Yes.
And this is a V-block 16-cylinder engine, and it's really a remarkable piece of technology. But of course, what happened was, by the time they had this ready, the jet had made its appearance, and nobody was interested in an improved version of a piston engine. And so what they did after the war was they took this technology and put it in a automobile engine, which became the famous Hemi engine.
Right.
That was the main engine that Chrysler used during the 1950s. The other thing was that Chrysler took some of the truck engineering that they used in the war and sort of domesticated it. This is a power wagon produced by Dodge that was a military truck and remained pretty much a military truck, a famously durable design, and actually Dodge continued to make these vehicles with very little design change up until at least 1970. A lot of these were going for export by then.
Really? Now, things went well for Chrysler until the 70s. Then there was a problem in the 1970s. Tell me a bit about that.
Well, during the 1960s, Ford and GM began to diversify their brands. It used to be that if you bought a Chevrolet or a Ford, you were paying less money, you were buying a car of a certain size and a certain level of lux, but fundamentally it was a size and power difference. By the 1960s, what happened was that each of these brands became a sort of entity in itself. There was a high-lux Ford, there was a low-lux Ford, there were different sizes, et cetera, and so on. General Motors did the same thing. Chrysler said, no junior editions. You can buy a Chrysler, you can buy a Dodge, you can buy a Plymouth, but we're not going to produce junior editions. They were very proud of the fact that there was no junior-sized Chrysler. Well, that worked fine until the 1970s when the first of the fuel shocks came.
Right.
And really the American auto industry after World War II, because petrol was so cheap here, had gradually got to the point it was an entity unto itself. It was producing these gigantic automobiles, tremendous engine and horsepower, and fuel economy wasn't a concern.
Right.
When the fuel shock hit, all of a sudden people became desperate to get smaller cars. Chrysler had just invested a tremendous amount of capital in developing new models that were all large, full size. And basically they were caught on the wrong foot.
Right. Yeah.
So what Chrysler had to do was embark on a crash program of coming up with suitable sized and fuel efficient automobiles. And Chrysler by then was the third ranked automaker, didn't have the resources of General Motors and Ford, and the company suffered terribly.
So how much of Chrysler's heritage can the company use now, or is using, to sort of, I don't know, help steer the company or to design future cars?
Well, Chrysler started out as an engineering-driven company, and even in the design excesses and the giddy sales years of the 50s and 60s, quality engineering was still a company value that remained. But when reality set in the 1980s, the engineering heritage stood Chrysler in good stead. And this car was produced as a concept or vision vehicle for Lamborghini at the time when we owned Lamborghini. Chrysler's probably building cars now that are as close to the ideal of what Chrysler was in the 20s, 30s, and 40s as it has in any time in its history. And it's sort of interesting that we now are merged with the former Daimler-Benz, because here you have two companies for whom engineering had been the touchstone.
Right.
That have joined together.
Right.
So in that sense, it's a very good match. The other thing is that Chrysler's doing some very interesting things in terms of marketing. Chrysler has always been a company that's tended to do well when it's trod a line somewhat apart from everyone else. When Chrysler came up with a PT Cruiser, they did something that, as far as I know, no other American company has done yet, which is produce a inexpensive but very trendy, sophisticated, and appealing car for the entry-level market.
Right, yeah.
And that was a vital thing for this company to do.
They really stuck their necks out there, didn't they, with that one?
Well, I think everyone was surprised at just how potent it turned out to be. In the company, the notion was that we were building a car that would have some success and would have world appeal, but I don't think anyone estimated just how potent that appeal would turn out to be.
Yeah, it's extraordinarily successful.
It has been extraordinarily successful.